Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the Packernet Podcast. I am your host and resident panelist, as always, Ryan Schlip. Check us out online, packernet.com. Find me on Twitter, pack_daddy. Giving it a little bit of extra juice today. a little bit of fire. All right. I wasn't sure what I was going to do until, I think, right this second. It just makes sense considering what we've done the last technically 3 days because of the mishap with uploading. And then there was the secondary mishap, which if you don't listen to Packernet After Dark or you missed the last one, let me just very briefly explain because you might be confused. Why did you replay yesterday's podcast today? I accidentally released yesterday's podcast 2 days ago. You know what I mean? So I released it and then I was like, oh shoot, that's supposed to be for tomorrow. So it's possible you heard that podcast and then the next day you're like, oh, the new podcast is up. You listen to it, it's the same podcast. If you go back and look to 2 days ago, that one's gone. So anywho, disaster. I've been a mess the last couple days trying to correctly do my freaking job and get you your podcasts. But I think over the last 2 days, it's been an interesting and, in my opinion, fun exploration of a couple things and trying to get things a little bit more correct, and try to better understand things. I think step one was maybe understanding different people and the way that they think, which is good for a lot of us that spend time fighting because regardless of where you are on any issue, sports or otherwise, when you see people with other views, you just think, I don't understand. I genuinely don't understand. And there's only so much you can understand, but the bottom line is, and I think it can help a little bit to understand that there are people that are wired differently, and people enjoy football differently, and people view the world differently and do things differently and whatever. And it isn't necessarily inherently good or bad. And it can be helpful to understand, again, for me, it's odd to see somebody say stats have ruined football. That's odd to me, and I very much don't agree. But I could see where they're coming from if, it's kind of like I opine for the days. I don't know if that's the right word. I yearn for the days. Oh, yeah, opine is definitely the wrong word. Yearn for the days of, 1970s football where we just watched the game and we cheered and we had a good time and it was all this stuff. And now it's become this freaking math equation and it's stupid or whatever. I can understand that. I don't get to that place. I just see it as continually getting better as we continue to understand, and I want to drill down more. I want to understand more and whatever, get more and more and more accurate and correct about what's really happening. But I find that stuff interesting. But I think the thing for yesterday that was important is kind of drilling down the distinction between that and also understanding that, just to be clear, it's okay to be on that side. But in my opinion, what I did yesterday was completely decimate the idea that my eyes say, which really, as we said, means my memory says, is an adequate measuring process or tool. It's absolutely not. And it can't be. And so, it's not my job to figure out how you would dance around that or figure that out. But, if you don't want to understand and you just want to have a good time, that's fine. But I'm very sorry to inform you that you can't just walk up to a group of people like me and say, here's what I know. And then when I say, well, I can find better information and tell you you're wrong, you get mad and say I shouldn't be allowed. That's not how that works. Now, I had this sitting up for a while, and I was kind of thinking, I don't think I should do this because the process, it's one of those things, and I'm kind of iffy on it just because I know how people are, especially with PFF. It has this stain to it. I mean, the PR for PFF has been horrible. And it's not necessarily because it's accurate. It's just that everybody has been stung by PFF. And for a lot of people, they don't have subscriptions to PFF. And one of the easiest ways to be a fake quasi-intellectual is to look at somebody who's smart and has views on things and just say, that's stupid. Because then you don't have to be smart. You just have to be smarter than the smart person by simply saying that's stupid. So everybody knows PFF is stupid or whatever. It's all stupid. Again, this is fully conceding the fact that PFF is very flawed, just like every stat is flawed. But it's nowhere near as flawed as literally just about anything else. Now, if you want to talk specifics about if we specifically talk about quarterback or if we specifically talk about this, there might be somewhat better metrics to use. But here's the deal, and this is what we're doing today. What if you wanted to sort of grade or look at every single position on a football field? What would you use? There's nothing else. There's nothing else. What other stats are you looking at for safeties? Their interceptions? The gap between the guys with, the 90% of the league with 0 to 1 or the guys with 2 to 3 or 4? Like, that's such a stupid metric. Tackles? Bears Empire over on Twitter doing some engagement bait, which I should probably post mine as well, although that would kind of give away. Well, maybe after tomorrow gets published. Very good engagement bait. Put out my NFC North position rankings: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, offensive line, defensive line. Don't put defensive line; you're going to annoy me. There's interior defensive line and there's edge rushers. They're not the same thing. Linebackers, corners, safeties. And we might just add special teams as well, because why not? Now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use PFF. There's probably going to be times where judgment needs to be made. Maybe not. Maybe, I don't know. As far as injuries, as far as this, that, whatever. The Vikings and their wide receiver groups. I'm going to try to not 100% rely on PFF because, we're only basing it on last year. Well, guys are hurt and they come back. What do you do with that guy? Or again, the Vikings, do their wide receivers step back to what they were now that J.J. McCarthy's presumably not the quarterback? Or do you kind of keep them there? Do you split the middle? I don't know. We'll find out when we get there. But when we look at things like, where do you rank the quarterbacks? He has it Bears, Lions, Packers, Vikings, hilariously, by the way, because he's a troll douche. It's the only way I can think to phrase that. He's a troll douche. By the way, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that the Vikings end up ahead of Chicago with quarterback. It's probably not going to work, but I will want that to be the case. But again, what is the goal here? Well, it's now that I've made the case that statistics have their role, and it's the best way to do these kinds of things. Let's use what we have to try to do this as accurately as we possibly can. It will be flawed to the max. No question about it. But it'll be so significantly better than this guy, Bears Empire, sitting back just going, I think quarterback, I think. And just about, not just about, I would almost guarantee of the 42 comments, every single one of them is going off of their gut. No way you have better linebackers. The Vikings, By the way, he has the Packers, dead last in wide receivers, dead last in offensive line, dead last in linebackers, dead last in corners. In a division completely devoid of corners. By the way, Terry and Arnold released by the Lions, and somehow we have the worst corner. This guy's a freaking idiot. He's clearly a Packers-hating idiot. Speaking of, what do you do with rookies like Brandon Cisse is another question. But we might as well get started here. We've got quite a bit to rip through. I don't want to take a break here. The only real news, Terry and Arnold was released by the Lions because of his legal situation. Kind of makes sense. I had mentioned, you never know, and hopefully that's not true, and blah, blah, blah. But when you look at some of the what do you call it? The reports, I guess, by the police, I'm not sure. They were talking about like they had chat messages. They were chatting back and forth to each other. They were streaming, not like on Facebook, but streaming to each other. Like the freaking trail of evidence that they led to each other is staggering. So it seemed unlikely that the evidence was going to exonerate Terry and Arnold, and apparently the Detroit Lions got to look at it at their starting corners situation and decided, this isn't going to work out, and they had to cut him loose. Now, we've kind of looked at quarterback already because it's been obviously a very talked about thing. But we're going to stick more closely to PFF because I want this to be consistent. So again, quarterback, there's a billion stats for quarterbacks. Much more so than offensive line and linebacker and all that kind of stuff. And so rather than give so much to quarterback, especially since we've already done that, we're just going to stick with PFF and primarily the PFF grades. So here I'm going to stick with overall because I don't want to discount rushing by just looking at the PFF passing grades. That will significantly help Caleb Williams, but ultimately doesn't make any real change. The questions at hand. Number one, the Minnesota Vikings and their quarterback situation. I think we all assume it's Kyler Murray, and so what version of Kyler Murray are you going to get? For the Bears, do we automatically grant Caleb Williams a step? The answer there, very obviously, no. And then Detroit Lions, Jared Goff, not a ton other than kind of similar to Jordan Love in that there's been some level of fluctuation, pretty consistent, but everybody kind of fluctuates. Where do you settle in? But if we just look at last year, Jordan Love was by far the best quarterback at an 88.9 grade. Jared Goff was a 77.7. Caleb was a 76.9. Kyler Murray was a 72.2. But the year prior when he was healthy, he was an 82. The last time before that, I mean, it's hard to say because he's always injured, at least to some kind of a degree. 2023 was like a half a year. 2022 was about a half a year. 2021 was pretty close to a half a year, and again, 80s. 2020, pretty full year, 80s. So he's been healthy about 3 of the last 6 years, and healthy is kind of an iffy thing, but let's say more than a half a year played. Again, only about 3 out of the last 6 years, but his grades in those years were 83, 83, 82. Pretty consistent. Then if we look at Goff, it's tough because his time in Detroit was 60, 72, 86, and then he started coming back down 79, 78. Now, I don't think I can just give him an 86 because he's done that once in his entire career. He usually settles in around 70s. He's been kind of high 70s the last few years. I think giving him last year's grade of a 77 makes sense. I also think it makes sense to kind of assume... It's tough to assume health with a guy that's almost never healthy. I think it would be pretty bait-worthy to say that Kyler Murray is arguably the best to second best quarterback if it was Packers, Vikings, Lions, Bears. But again, make the case that if Kyler's healthy, he isn't the top to second best quarterback. The only thing you can go off of are the years in which, I mean, aside from his rookie year, he had a 64 grade, but ever since then, his lowest was a 67. He wasn't healthy that year. He wasn't healthy in 2023 or 2025. So again, it's 83, 83, 82. It's shockingly consistent. So you can either assume he's not going to be healthy or grant him health, in which case you put him at, maybe give him the lowest, which is about an 82. Maybe you round it down to an 80 just for the sake of injury. Or do you ask the question, who would you rather have? In which case you would dock Kyler. But I don't know if I would do it as much as Caleb, because Caleb is an unknown based on his talent. Kyler is not really an unknown. He's a known quantity. He's known to be a pretty good quarterback. It's just that he's had some health issues. Jordan also is a little bit tricky, but he's just been good for since he's been here. 84, 76, and 89 have been his grades. 89 obviously being his best, despite dealing with constant injuries and everything else. I wouldn't have a problem just giving him an 85. I mean, in 2023, he had an 84 grade. 2024, he was injured, still managed to 76. 2025, he had an 89 despite a couple injuries himself, as well as losing basically his entire team. So I think Jordan's getting an 85. He's going to be number 1. I think at number 2, I'm going to take Goff because you get the security of the reliability as well as probably a mid-70s grade, which, by the way, remember, worst case scenario for Jordan was a 76. We're saying Goff is at about a 77. The year prior was a 78. He had his one outlier year in 2023 when everything was going right. He's also been trending downward. The offensive line is a serious problem. New offensive coordinator. I mean, to act as though there's no questions with Goff, also untrue. So I think the biggest question is, do we bet on Caleb to not regress, potentially take a step? Because even if he doesn't, we're talking about him being at about a 75, let's say. The problem is that's kind of, I mean, Kyler kind of hovers around mid to low 70s in injured years. So that's kind of his floor. Again, it just comes down to the injury stuff. Kyler will very likely be a better quarterback if they both play the full year. But Caleb is more likely to play the full year. Also worth noting that Kyler has got a really good wide receiver in Justin Jefferson this year, potentially a better play caller than he's had at his entire time in Arizona. So a better number one wide receiver and probably a better play caller, best probably for both in his entire career. I know it seems like this is crazy because the Vikings quarterback situation is supposed to be dog crap and Caleb is supposed to be this great whatever. But that really for me is what it comes down to. If you're guaranteeing health for both players, Kyler is the right choice. Screw it. I said I would try, and I did. Kyler's going to be ahead, Minnesota Vikings, then Chicago Bears. Anywho, there's your taste. We'll take a break. We'll come back and rip through these other positions. All right, running back is next. Now, again, there's going to be some questions, especially surrounding the Green Bay Packers when it comes to running back, considering we don't know exactly what's going to happen with our running back situation, and it does make a pretty big difference. For the Chicago Bears, the big question mark, I guess, kind of becomes what do we do with Swift, because last year he had a freakish sort of a breakout compared to how the rest of his career has gone. And he's been very up and down. I mean, he had a really big year his final year in Detroit and then kind of fell off again. So his grades were 70, then 60, then 83, then 73, then 65, then 87. So I think the assumption is, well, the run game in Chicago with Ben Johnson is just going to be elite, right? Like it was in 2022 with Ben Johnson, even though 2020 and 2021, not as much. But that Ben Johnson with Swift is just going to be an elite combination. Maybe, but that hasn't been the case for him in the past. Secondarily, the offensive line did take a little bit of a hit for Chicago, specifically at the center position, and I think that that's maybe pushes us a little bit further in the direction of I don't know that he necessarily repeats that. But he was the highest graded as far as the rushing grades. If you look at overall grades, Josh Jacobs was number one, then Jameer Gibbs, then Swift as a very close 1, 2, 3, 86, 86, and 83. Jordan Mason had actually the second highest rushing grade, but his overall grade was down to a 74. Aaron Jones all the way down at a 65 grade, so I don't know that that's much of a factor here. But I think it's, in my opinion, relatively straightforward. Because it's so close between Gibbs, Swift, and Jacobs, it makes sense to just put Jacobs at the bottom, at least of that pile. So I would probably, because I would trust Jameer Gibbs more, put Detroit number one and then Chicago number two. The only question after that becomes, what do you do from there? And I think, given the fact that, as far as we know, Josh Jacobs will be our running back, the fact that, you know, it's still the same line, it's still, not that it was great, but I mean, it produced what Josh Jacobs' grades were. And we have a guy that's kind of an unknown commodity and could not very easily, but could very potentially still, even if he is the starting guy, be at the level of Jordan Mason. I would probably take the Packers, then Minnesota. Wide receiver is going to be tricky because there's so many. So at wide receiver, I'm just looking at the top three across the board. there's a couple things, I guess, that stand out. First of all, again, we got to have that conversation about Minnesota. Do we just automatically grant a bounce back for the top two guys in Minnesota? Not necessarily, I don't think, no. The only two teams whose wide receiver 3 is not below a 70 are Chicago and Green Bay. Jaden Reed last year had a 70.2 as the third highest graded. And then Chicago was at a 70 as the third highest graded. Minnesota at a 67, Detroit at a 63. Minnesota also does not have a second player that is at a 70 or higher, so 65 and 67. In other words, Green Bay, if Minnesota doesn't bounce back, Green Bay has a higher number 1 than they have, with Watson grading out higher than Justin Jefferson did, and our number 2 and 3 grade higher than their 2 and 3. In other words, our 3 grades higher than their 2. The highest graded is Amon-Ra St. Brown. So let's just say we give a minor bounce back at least to put Justin Jefferson above Christian Watson. If we give him 3 points based on better quarterback play, put him at an 83.5, puts him just ahead of Christian Watson. That still is just barely in front of, and if we grant the same bounce, the 3 points does not put their 2 and 3 ahead of either of our 2 or 3. Green Bay also has almost the same grades, with the exception of our number 1 being much higher than their, well, I guess if you swap it, either way, our number 1 is higher than their number 1, our number 2 is higher than their number 2, our number 3 is higher than their number 3. Very close on the 2 and 3, but the big gap is our number 1 compared to their number 1, with Watson being an 83, and for them it would be Burden, even though he was not their number 1 in terms of targets, he was their highest graded player at a 77. So Green Bay would be ahead of Minnesota, ahead of Chicago. The question is, do you put them ahead of Detroit? Because their number 1 is quite a bit higher than our number 1. Amon-Ra is ahead of Christian Watson. Their number 2 is ahead of our number 2, and their number 3 is behind, but slightly behind. So I would probably put Detroit number 1. Then I would put Green Bay. The question is it Minnesota or Chicago? If we're saying Jefferson is mid-80s, that's massively ahead of Chicago. If we give a slight bump, that puts, in other words, give the same 3 points, that puts it basically as a tie, so their number 2s are tied, and then the number 3 would just be like a 2-point difference. So it would be Minnesota and then Chicago. And by the way, I like Chicago's receivers. I think they have 3 solid receivers, potentially, at least 2, but potentially 3. Khalif Raymond is the big question mark, but again, he had a 70 grade last year. But I think all 3 groups have an argument. Minnesota could very easily be the worst wide receiver group if you don't grant them any kind of a bump. And if you didn't, I'd probably put Chicago ahead. But I'm not going to. Then we get to tight end, and this one's probably going to tick off a lot of Packer fans. But unfortunately, Colston, Loveland, and Sam LaPorta graded higher than Tucker Kraft. It was a close 3-way race. And by the way, Vikings fans are also ticked because, what about our guy? He's not really in the conversation. It's a 3-way race between Tucker Kraft, Sam LaPorta, and Colston Loveland. They're all kind of hovering between the 80 to 85 range. Tucker Kraft came in at a 78. LaPorta was an 82. Colston Loveland was an 84. If you just look at the receiving grades, it doesn't change, but it gets a little closer. Tucker was an 83. LaPorta was 83 too. Loveland was an 86. So for the sake of what we're doing and being consistent, it also doesn't help that, Tucker did get hurt and he only had the 1 half a year where it was really his big breakout year. Colston Loveland did this as a rookie. LaPorta has been dominant pretty much forever. Again, I'm guessing most Packer fans would put Tucker number 1. I can't do that. I think he has the potential to be, but I would assume Colston going into year 2 is not going to get much worse. I think he's potentially a freak in the making. We'll have to see. But I mean, he was just pretty consistently dominant throughout the season. So I think he's just going to be a force of nature. And then the final one before the break, we'll look at the offensive lines. Obviously, there's a lot of guys, a lot of questions. Minnesota, again, with the question of, do you give him a bounce back with, for example, Darisaw? Darisaw's been very, very good for a long time. He had a 65 grade this past year, but he only played about a half a year or so. I think part of the issue, though, is that it was still a half a year. I guess he was probably injured the whole year, so it's a problem. The other issue, though, is if you go back to last year, he played even less the year prior in 2024. So he hasn't been healthy since 2023. And in 2022, his grade was a 90, and it's gone from 90 to 82 to 81 and then 65 this year. So I probably want to give him a little bit of a bounce back, like I give Banks a slight bump back to pre-injury from like a nothing to a slightly better than nothing grade. But I don't know how far I can go back with him after 2 full years of injury. First of all, can I feel confident that he's going to be healthy? And even so, what version of him do you get? So, maybe give him a little bit of grace. For Detroit, does the Penei Sewell move kind of cause any problems from right tackle to left tackle? Probably not. I think the question for the top team here, I mean, I know who the worst offensive line is. It's Green Bay. They're 4th. The question is, do you go Chicago or Detroit? Chicago is more baseline good, 70-70, 60-70, 80. Whereas Detroit is, would you trade to have 360s, 170, but you get Penei Sewell at a 90? I think I'd rather be good across the board, especially when you have 180 at right tackle. So you still have your really good right tackle. But then 70, 70, 70, just your worst position is in the center, and the guy got about an average grade. So I'd probably go for offensive line, Chicago, then Detroit, then Minnesota, then Green Bay, unfortunately. So to recap, quarterback, I have Green Bay number 1. Running back, Green Bay's number 3. Wide receiver, Green Bay's number 2. Tight end, Green Bay's number 3. Offensive line, Green Bay is number 4. We'll take a break, look at defense on the other side. All right, starting off with defensive tackle. I think the biggest question for me is Detroit, because you've got primarily Alim McNeill and Levi Onwuzurike. Onwuzurike hasn't played since 2024. He was pretty good in 2024, but it was just kind of a one-year thing. And he's 28 years old, coming back from an entire missed 2025 season. And then you got McNeill, similarly. He was 60, then 70, then 87 in 2023 when everything was great. 2024, he drops, still very good, but drops to an 80. 2025, he's injured. He comes back week 7, plays the rest of the season, and is awful. 52 grade. Well, he's injured, all that kind of stuff. All right, but goes back to what? Is he going to go back to the 70s, back to the 80s, back to when he was in the 60s? Is he ruined now? Is he bad now? I don't know. I get the impression if they both come back and they're both healthy, you get some kind of a better version of them, but I don't know. And then for the Packers, the complicated thing becomes, look, if we're just looking at grades and we're not looking at pass rush versus run defense just overall, the 2 worst graded players are Wyatt and Brooks, if we have 3 defensive tackles in our 3-4 system. Now, Wyatt is one of the higher graded pass rushers of the group, but that's a real thing. And Chicago has bad defensive tackles. The fact that we have 2 defensive tackles worse than their 2 defensive tackles says something. Now, I am going to grant Wyatt the pass rush thing here because I would much rather have a very good pass rusher. On top of that, we've added Javon Hargrave, who is, the third best of the group. And I put one of the Detroit guys. I should put him at the same level as one of the Detroit guys, so I'll say he's the second best. Either way, I know we can put Chicago last here. I mean, you could argue Detroit would be next, but that's silly considering, again, with the two guys, I don't know. I really struggle to put Green Bay last with maybe the best pass rush duo in the entire NFC North. So I don't think I can put them last. The next, well, I guess they could arguably be third. This has got to be probably the toughest one, and Detroit is really mucking this up because you could easily put them as the best. You could also put them as the third best. You could probably even put them as the worst if you wanted to. And then, Minnesota doesn't really have very good guys, but the two guys that, well, one of them graded in the 70s last year, which is good. The other guy was high 50s, and then they have a rookie, which I don't know what to do with a rookie. Most rookies are just getting around a 60 grade. I think if I'm just being honest, just based on what we have, I got to put Green Bay third. I'll put Detroit second just because how in the heck can Minnesota be number one, though? That doesn't make any sense. I don't know. I really don't know. Do I just put Detroit number one so it feels less weird? I hate this. I really hate this. I don't know. Again, you could slot Green Bay. You could even argue Chicago number one. I mean, I don't think that they are. But, I mean, Javon Dexter led all the NFC North defensive tackles and sacks last year. Again, I don't super care about that. He had a sub 10% pass rush rate, pressure rate. So it was largely just volume. I mean, Redmond, you could argue, is like the best defensive tackle of the group in Minnesota. I don't know. Minnesota's number one. I feel so. It's four bad defensive tackle groups, and nobody's going to feel good being number one. So that just is what it is. Wyatt needs to come back healthy and perform. By the way, doing this just pushes me even further in the direction of we should not pay Devontae Wyatt this year. He needs to have one more year to prove that he can do something. All right, now we get to edge, where it gets a little bit more fun. Yes, Micah is hurt, but listen, similar to a lot of other guys like Detroit with their defensive tackles or, the quarterback situation or whatever, he's mostly going to be seen as all the way back. But there's also some pretty talented pass rushers in this group. And I think at the very least, Aiden Hutchinson should be number one, considering they basically tied as far as their overall grade. Micah Parsons was a 91.9, Aiden was a 91.2. However, Lucas Van Ness was the fourth highest graded, whereas their number two right now would be DJ Wonham, who had a 56 grade. Lucas Van Ness had a 76 grade. So there's no question that the Green Bay edge rush duo of Parsons and Van Ness is better than Hutchinson and DJ Wonham. But it's just a question of how much do you discount the fact that Micah is injured, or do you at all? Or are we just comparing kind of strength on strength, in which case, again, we got to revisit. Although I did put Minnesota ahead of Chicago. You would have to maybe put Minnesota ahead of Detroit then, but I don't know, whatever. Montez Sweat for Chicago was seventh with a 72.4 grade. And when I say seventh, I'm talking NFC North last year is all I'm looking at. Deo Odangbo ranked 24th out of 30 with a 53.5 grade. And then Minnesota is looking at Andrew Van Ginkel and Dallas Turner. So, I mean, it's kind of we know who 1 and 2 are. We know who 3 and 4 are. It's just a question of where do you go with it. Look, I'll just give it to Detroit because of the injury, I guess. I don't know. I should have better defined what exactly we're looking at here, but then it comes down to Minnesota with a declining 31-year-old Andrew Van Ginkel, and what they hope is an improving Dallas Turner, although he never really has. He had a 64 grade, then a 65 grade. he's the same guy. Andrew Van Ginkel had a great year in Miami with a 91 grade, went to Minnesota. It's been 71 and 70s, or 71, 71. So it's pretty, both of these guys have been very consistent. So it's 70 and 65. Chicago 73, 53. I would definitely take Minnesota over Chicago. That's not even really a question, considering their number ones are about the same. Their number two is significantly worse. So I'll go Detroit, Green Bay, Minnesota, Chicago. Green Bay does have the best pass rush duo in the NFC North, but again, Micah is going to be out, a third of the year or whatever it is. At linebacker, Chicago's Devin Bush is going to be tough because he's been bad for 5 straight years, then went to Cleveland and was dominant. So is he still dominant, or was that mostly a Cleveland thing? I mean, his grades were 60, 50, 30, 50, 50. Then it was 80, 80. And last year was an 88. So he would be the number 2 linebacker behind only Jack Campbell. And Edgerrin Cooper, I know, obviously a lot of Packer fans would put him at the top. He's kind of a question in and of himself. He had an 87 grade his first year, then dropped to a 76 this past year. So it was not as good of a year. I can't just prop him up to his rookie year. So I'm going to leave him at what he was last year, which was a 76. So I think the worst linebacking group here is going to be Minnesota. After that, oh boy. So again, the high-low here is Detroit, which I think Detroit either way is ahead of Green Bay. So it's a question of, do you take the 90-60 or do you take the 70-70 or 70-75 or whatever? I probably want the 90-60, so I'll go Detroit number 1. Then it's going to be Chicago. Then it's going to be Green Bay. I gave Edgerrin his 76, but Zaire Franklin, I put it at 60. He had a much worse year last year, but there was a lot of changes that took place. He's been pretty much 60s across the board prior to that, so I just put him at the 60 range. At corner, there's big questions about, at Chicago, for example, where do I put Jalen Johnson? Bears fans want him to be 2023 Jalen Johnson. He was like the top corner in football. Unfortunately, in 2024, he dropped off to a 76, which is still good, but he was perfectly healthy that year, so either way, he's not going back to that. 2025, he was injured. So he played about a half a year-ish, third of a year, whatever, and had a 58 grade. The other complication is that his first 3 years were 50, 60, 60. So, look, I guess I'll put him back in the 70 range. I'm not going to put him all the way back up to a 76 because that was in 2024 when he was coming off a really high year. It was also coming, he's at a 58 since then and is coming off an injury. So I'll give him, I guess, like a 72 or something. Similar problems with Kyler Gordon. He started off not great, 40, 60. Then he was in the 70s. And then last year he was hurt. So you could just revert him back to his 76. But again, in 2023, he was in the 60s, just like in 2025. Even though it's very small sample size, we've seen more of it. So I will push him back to about the 70s, but low 70s, similar to Johnson. I'll just give him a 70 straight up. But massive question marks. I mean, if both of those guys are not healthy, or if they're not, able to perform, or if they're not as good as they were, it turns into a pretty bad cornerback group pretty fast. So it's another weird thing where it's like, man, I hate to give credit to somebody because they're not good, but nobody's really good here. You probably have to go Chicago number 1. Again, a ton of questions, but it's not like there's a lot of competition here for a room that might be kind of good. I mean, the Packers have a draft pick, but I'm not going to make that a high grade. Valentine, I think, is our best shot at being good, but I don't even have him listed as a starter right now because I have it Keyshawn, Bullard, and Cisse. Now, on the positive side for Packer fans, not that it really matters, and I've been saying this for a while, we underrate our corners. We have average corners. We don't have bad corners. So I guess I put Chicago 1. I think Detroit is 3. Again, I know Packer fans would probably immediately push us to dead last. If I said 3, I meant 4 for Detroit. Now that they've lost one of their starting corners, who was not even good to begin with, they do have DJ Reed, but he did not have as good of a year as I think they were hoping. Otherwise, it looks like right now, and this is subject to change, but in the slot, they have Roger McCreary and then rookie, I believe, 5th-round pick, Keith Abney. And no, I generally am giving 60s, but for a 5th-round pick, no, you're not getting an average grade. So Detroit is going to come in last. That would leave it with Minnesota and Green Bay. And, Isaiah Rodgers has graded out fairly well like every year. Last year was his first year starting at a 74 grade. So it's kind of hard to argue that he's better than any of our corners. Again, unless you want to give Cisse something, which I'm not going to do that. So given that they at least have like a number 1 kind of, I guess you would go Minnesota 2 and Green Bay 3. Safety, without hardly even looking into it, I'm guessing Minnesota is going to be 4. We're looking at Theo Jackson and Josh Metellus. Metellus is 28. He's been going downhill for a while. He had a 70 grade his first year starting in Minnesota. That went down to a 65. That went down to a 55. And then Theo Jackson, the 2022 6th-round pick, he kind of like played half the year last year, which is about the most he's ever played, about 529 snaps, 68 grade. So I already know Minnesota's going to be in that slot. Detroit has a bunch of question marks. I'm sure a lot of people would want to push them relatively high, but there's injury issues. There's a bunch of issues here. If you look at Kirby Joseph, for example, his 1 year in 2024 was a massive outlier. His other grades were 64, 56, and 59. And last year, he had a 59 playing like a quarter of the season. I don't see him as an elite corner. I see him as a mediocre 3rd-round pick that had 1 dominant year. Then you have Brian Branch, which is kind of similar. He's a very good football player, but he also had a big breakout 2024 year. Otherwise, he's settled in around a 78-ish, including last year, and he's got injury issues as well, but I'll probably just leave him about there. Bears have rookie Dylan Thieneman, another one that everybody would probably push to the top. I'm sorry, he's getting a 60 grade just like everybody else. You call it a 65 if you want. I don't care. I know everybody's this elite player when they're a rookie and nobody's ever seen them, and then 3 years later, everybody forgets their name. After that, they went out and got Kobe Bryant, who had a 70 grade in Seattle last year, so we'll leave it at about that. So pretty similar to Detroit, honestly. Just maybe slightly less. Kobe Bryant compared to to Branch. Then we have Xavier McKinney, who is the top safety in football, along with Evan Williams, who had about the same grade as Chicago's best safety. So you have like the best and 3rd best safeties in football. Green Bay is going to be number 1. That's not really a debate. Then I think it is Detroit. Then it is Chicago. Then it is Minnesota. I'm actually going to go back. I'm going to make a change because it's been bothering me. I'm giving Green Bay the number 1 edge spot. They are going to have 3/4 of the season with by far the best edge group in football. And Detroit has such terrible edge depth. I can't do it. I just can't do it, especially if I'm going to downgrade Detroit's interior despite having maybe the best pass rush group. In fact, screw that. They're going to number 2. I'm not giving them number 1. But they're going to number 2. So those are nothing. I'm not touching anything else. But those have been bothering me, just because the Packers have the best defensive line. But I've downgraded everybody, and I know the run defense isn't fantastic. But I got our linebackers 3rd on the list. It's not like I'm really rating that very highly. So overall, I have Green Bay number 1 in 3 spots. And 3 spots only. Edge, who I just put us there. Safety, this past group, and then quarterback. I have Detroit number 1 at running back, wide receiver, and linebacker. Chicago is number 1 at tight end, offensive line, and corner. And Minnesota, I have number 1, which Vikings fans would be shaking their head probably, but at defensive tackle. And that is simply because of how bad everybody else is. It feels really weird to do that. Again, I have Chicago last. I think you can make a case they could be first. It could be any freaking combination you want. Green Bay had to be at least second, though, especially among a bad group. I couldn't put them number 1, honestly, just because of how bad Wyatt is overall based on the metric we're actually using. But it's just a bad group of defensive tackles overall. I'm hoping the Packers have at least a very good pass rush on the interior. But overall, I mean, if you just look at the number 1s outside of Minnesota, I mean, it's what, 3-3-3? And I think the Packers get a clear edge here because the two most important positions, you could argue, quarterback and edge, the Packers are number 1 in those specific categories. The Packers being last in offensive line is the biggest and most serious problem. But if you look beyond that, another premier spot is wide receiver. We rank 2nd. Tight end, we're 3rd, but I mean, it's like a 3-way tie. Running back, similarly, depending on the Josh Jacobs situation, we're 3rd, but it's basically a 3-way tie. So, I mean, the two biggest areas that the Packers could use the biggest bump would be, number 1, the offensive line. I don't know that they really climb all that high on this particular list, but, they're last and deservedly. That's not a 3-way or 4-way tie. We need better play. We got Zach Tom. We need Morgan to be a good left tackle. We need Banks to step it up a little bit, hopefully not as an injured guy. And Belton is a huge part of the reason why our offensive line rankings and grades were so low. His grading was terrible. But, again, he only played a third or a quarter of the season at right guard. He needs more opportunities there to see what he can become. But that's the biggest one. And then corner, I mean, if Cisse can be a dude, or if we all kind of get our wish and it's like Valentine playing at top 15 cornerback level, which he's done, top 10-ish at times. Yes, I know that sounds crazy, but it's true. And then Cisse can be a decent player. And Bullard, Bullard, I think, I don't want to say we overrate him, but it would surprise people to see what specifically his grade is. It's not bad, but it's not as high as I think a lot of people would expect it to be. It's a 65 is what it is. He's solid enough. And coverage was his biggest asset. And I know that the run defense and tackling grades can come up for him. They weren't bad. But corner, I think there's room to grow. And, question marks in all the other groups as well with Chicago and Minnesota, certainly. Good or bad. I mean, Chicago might have an elite cornerback room if those guys come back and dominate. Or it might be dog crap. But if you were to ask me to rank all of the position groups in the NFC North, this is essentially what I would come up with. Something along these lines. And do I feel good about it? Yeah, I do. The only thing I don't like is occasionally you have to start giving some of the other teams some credit in areas that I don't want to. I guess maybe they are kind of good here, or, kind of like the Bears and their corners. I like talking trash. It's like, bro, you guys are hurt. They haven't done anything in a couple of years. And that's all true. But if you just lay everybody's cards on the table, I can't put anybody above Chicago at corner as much as I would like to. It's interesting, too. I saw a video. Probably won't do anything with it, but I just kind of poke around on YouTube and whatnot. And one of the Chicago Bears things was, what if we did kind of an interesting exercise where, are we overrating our offense? Are we underrating our defense? I think there's a case to be made for them, yes, in both directions. The defense, I mean, they were like dead last. I don't know in what metrics or whatever, but it was just regression to the mean. You would assume they're going to take some steps. They at least have a decent pass rusher on their group. They have defensive tackles that certainly could improve. Their corners are the biggest thing, right? Where if those guys come back healthy and are very good, that's a huge leap. Dylan Thieneman is a big question mark that could massively help them if he can be a good player. So, anywho, I think if nothing else, it tells us what we already knew, and that's going to be that this is kind of a potential slugfest. And Minnesota is the biggest wild card. You know, again, we started off with quarterback. You could put, if you wanted to, depending on how you twist these things, you could put Minnesota number 1 at quarterback. If you said you have to assume health, the most consistently solid player would be Minnesota, Kyler Murray. If you wanted to downgrade Jordan a little bit to just be like, okay, well, it's like, you know, high 70s, low 70s, and then high 80s, I'll give him like a solid 80 grade, and then Goff gets a 77, but Kyler gets, what, an 84? No, I don't think anybody would do that, but all I'm saying is if he's healthy, he could be the best quarterback in the division. Caleb could be the best quarterback in the division. You know I don't want to say that, but of course it could be true. The guy has Mahomes and then some potential. If he actually, and I said this about all their quarterbacks going back to Trubisky, if these guys can actually, if it can click between the ears, we're screwed. That guy's going to be scary good. And Goff, you know, he fluctuates between like high 70s and high 80s. He could have a really good year. Anywho, I'll leave it at that, and we can update this as time goes on. I probably won't. I should save this. I probably won't. Nah, I'll. The question is, will I ever be able to find it again? But I'll save it. Anyways, I'll leave it at that, and I will talk to you later. Have a good one. Bye-bye.